The Jewish exception. How systemic exclusion shaped moneylending, and how myth distorted its meaning. When most people hear Jewish moneylender, they hear a stereotype. When I tell you the real story, I hope you feel grief, and also understanding of how systems force people into unlikely roles. 1. Exclusion and opportunity. In medieval Europe, Jews were often barred from land ownership, many trades, guild membership, and public office. They lived in a world of legal limits. Meanwhile, Christian doctrine forbade Christians from lending with interest, usury, at least in many territories and periods. The result, economic demand for credit existed, but Christian lenders often could not serve it without ecclesiastical backlash. Jews, as religious minorities, were not bound by Christian canon law. So in many places, they filled the credit void, lending money, serving merchants, financing projects. So yes, sometimes, Jewish communities became prominent in moneylending, not because they preferred it, but because the system left them few options. 2. Contracts, credit, and legal protections. Lending in the medieval world was risky. You needed legal enforceability, courts to enforce contracts. Some property or collateral, often land, goods, or pledges. Reputation and networks. Jewish lenders often used many safeguards. Written contracts. Witnesses. Collateral, goods, land rights, future income. Letters of credit, trade networks. Because they were minorities, they had to be precise and legally rigorous to avoid disputes, persecution, or accusations. 3. Resentment, power, and expulsions. Because lending often involved Christian borrowers, nobles, monarchs, merchants, resentment built. Debtors didn't like creditors. Rulers borrowed heavily, then penalized their lenders when they lacked ability or will to repay. Anti-Semitic tropes painted Jewish lenders as greedy exploiters, even when they were fulfilling necessary economic functions. Expulsions were a way to cancel debts, seize assets, and consolidate power, disguised as moral or religious purging. Examples. England, 1290, King Edward I expelled Jews, cancelled debts owed to them, and seized their properties. France and Spain had repeated expulsions, often intertwined with reconquest, religious zeal, and debt politics. 4. Myth versus reality, breaking the stereotype. The stereotype of the Jewish banker is powerful and false in many ways. Reality. Most medieval Jews were not bankers. Many were tailors, scribes, scholars, artisans. Lending was risky, low margin, and socially fraught, not always lucrative. Many Jewish communities themselves were vulnerable to debt, poverty, and persecution. Stereotypes of greed ignored centuries of vulnerability, displacement, and legal oppression. Myth made coercion look like choice. Myth made victimhood look like power. Myth erased the real constraints. 5. What this teaches us today. When people are excluded, they adapt. When systems forbid avenues, new ones emerge, sometimes with moral complexity. If we want a more just economy, we must remember how constraints shape outcomes. We should resist moralizing those who operate under force. We must demand systems built with dignity, not exclusion. Closing reflection. The story of Jewish moneylenders isn't a story of inherent virtue or vice. It's a story of dispossessed people navigating a world that restricted them, and doing what they had to in imperfect conditions. Accusation without context is cruelty. Understanding without justification is justice. As we work toward a new economy, we carry this lesson. Before we judge roles, let's change the rules. Chapter 5. The Rise of the Bankers. When money stopped being a relationship and became a system. In the last chapter, we saw how lending used to be deeply moralized, viewed through the lens of charity, power, and religious duty. But as cities grew, trade expanded, and empires needed financing, something shifted. What began as a spiritual warning slowly became an economic necessity. And so emerged a new kind of figure in society. The banker. Not a priest. Not a merchant. Not a ruler. But a new kind of middleman, one who didn't just move goods, but moved trust. And as the banker rose, the soul of money began to disappear. 1. From temples to trade halls. In ancient societies, money was often tied to temples. Giving, sharing, and even forgiving debts were spiritual acts. But in medieval Italy, especially in Venice, Florence, and Genoa, merchant families began building new systems. They invented bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, merchant banks. These tools allowed them to lend across borders, track complex debts, and scale credit without carrying gold. Suddenly, lending wasn't just tolerated, it became essential to trade. The Medici family in Florence used banking to build an empire, funding art, war, and even popes. And other families followed suit. 2. Why the rules started to change. As economic power shifted from church to capital, moral arguments lost ground to market law.